Recently, I had the opportunity to collaborate with fellow Orthodox Christians Cassian from Barrel-Aged Faith and Ben from Cleave to Antiquity. And during those conversations, I shared a little bit about my personal journey into Holy Orthodoxy. If you're interested in checking that out, the links are in the description below. The short story is, after being raised in Neo-Protestantism my entire life, I applied my skills as a lawyer, a litigator, to investigate Christianity. Now that I say it out loud, it sounds a little bit like the Lee Strobel story, you know, like the Case for Christ guy. Yeah. Sad in focus. Fun fact, a lot of people think that Lee Strobel is a lawyer. He's not actually a lawyer. He's just a journalist that enjoys studying law. Anyway, it was about 2 years ago when I went on this fact-finding mission and I investigated various branches of Protestantism. I investigated the non-Chalcedonians. I investigated Roman Catholicism, and I discovered that those theological systems have some pretty serious disqualifiers. In this video, I'm going to discuss one of the main reasons why I went with Holy Orthodoxy over Roman Catholicism, which is namely the Roman Catholic doctrine of the papacy. So we're going to address the Roman Catholic authority claims, like what exactly are they? We're going to discuss hierarchies of authority. We're going to go over some historical examples, and we're going to address some common counter arguments at the very end. Thanks again for clicking on this video, guys. My name is Alex. I'm an Orthodox Christian and a lawyer that enjoys talking about Christian theology and apologetics. If you like that kind of content, don't forget to like the video before you leave and subscribe to the channel for more. Also, if you're willing and able to support the channel with a small monthly donation, I do have channel memberships open. With a membership, you'll be able to see videos like this before anyone else does with early access. You'll have access to a growing live streams archive. You'll have priority responses to your comments on my videos, and as the channel grows, you'll get more and more benefits. So let's get into it. Right from the outset, I do want to make it very clear that Roman Catholicism certainly has its beautiful aspects. It has a very rich artistic and architectural tradition, a rich intellectual tradition, and there's some of the most tenacious advocates for fighting for the rights of babies in the womb, namely not unaliving them. And there may even be something that we can learn from Roman Catholics, at least from that respect. But it seems to me that it's becoming increasingly difficult for a Roman Catholic to reconcile the traditional faith that they received from their parents and grandparents with the words and actions of their supreme pontiff, the Bishop of Rome. Let's recap just some of the events that have occurred since the current Pope Leo XIV has accepted the papal office. A few weeks ago, a Skittles Mass occurred in St. Peter's Basilica with the Pope's knowledge and seemingly his approval.
We saw yesterday the Vatican be absolutely defiled by 1,400 practicing homosexuals who marched into the Vatican and defiled it by promoting their abomination of pride and their abomination of sodomy. And what is honestly so disgusting about this is the fact that the Vatican not only allowed this to take place, but also the fact that so many Catholic apologists, so many Catholic reporters are completely silent about it.
We see the addition of a Muslim prayer room at the Vatican Library to accommodate visiting Muslim scholars.
According to reports, a Muslim prayer room has been established in the Vatican's Apostolic Library after visiting Muslim scholars complained they had nowhere to pray.
The Vatican Apostolic Library has granted Muslim scholars a dedicated prayer space inside its historic premises. He said the gesture towards Muslim scholars symbolizes the Vatican's ongoing commitment to interfaith dialogue and cultural understanding.
It sets a precedent. We have given a space in the Vatican for Muslim worship. Just think about the nonsense that is permitted in the church. We've become an NGO.
Like, can you imagine going to the Saudi government and asking for a chapel by the Kaaba so that visiting Christian scholars have a place to pray and perform the liturgy? So tragically, while the Skittles are allowed to have their mass at St. Peter's Basilica and the Muslim scholars are permitted to have their prayer room at the Vatican Library, you don't see the same courtesy extended to traditional Roman Catholics. There is an enormous and systematic push from the Vatican to discontinue the traditional Tridentine Latin Mass from occurring anywhere.
In some places, the traditional Latin Mass grew by 5 to 6x. Those in the Pope Francis leadership observed that, and they said, this is getting out of hand. This isn't just old people that are nostalgic. This has become a youth movement. They issued Traditionis Custodes, bringing about the restrictions of the Latin Mass.
It's to the point where some traditional Roman Catholics feel that they're isolated or even being corralled by their own leadership.
The idea is corral theory. We're going to move them, the traditional Catholics, more and more together. We're going to push them into one group and then close the gate. And then they'll kind of be treated sort of as an ecumenical gesture, sort of like Eastern Orthodox. You guys have valid sacraments, we can't deny that. And, you guys can come to Rome and we'll have discussions and meetings, but you're not really Catholic. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I am concerned and I am frustrated.
So what do we see? We see the Vatican catering to the Skittles. We see the Vatican catering to the Muslim scholars. The only people they're not catering to are the traditional Roman Catholics, the guys that support the Vatican the most. I'm not a Roman Catholic, but I still feel that like my feelings are even hurt by this. And let's not forget those off-the-cuff comments where Pope Leo seemed to be equivocating between the pro-life cause and illegal immigration and the death penalty.
Someone who says I'm against abortion but says I'm in favor of the death penalty is not really pro-life. So someone who says that I'm against abortion but I'm in agreement with the inhuman treatment of immigrants who are in the United States, I don't know if that's pro-life.
I suppose, by a certain definition of pro-life, I suppose that's true. I mean, with a sufficiently broad definition of the term pro-life, I guess, if I kill a spider, I might not be considered pro-life.
Then recently you have the guy that urinated on the altar in St. Peter's Basilica.
What is clear is that this scene was a desecration, given that it took place in a sacred space. The altar needed to be purified.
From what I could tell, it seems like that guy was never punished and he just got off scot-free. If I'm wrong about that, please let me know in the comments. I would love to be wrong about that. Then you have the blessing of the notorious environmental ice ball.
Let us offer our warmest welcome to Pope Leo XIV.
The endless greed of humans has to stop.
Lord of life, bless this water. May the dialogue we engage in contain respect for all gathered here and the entire Earth community.
From what I gather, it seems like most Trad Caths weren't necessarily opposed to the blessing of the environmental ice ball. They just thought it was weird.
I would now like to invite you to stand for the blessing of the waters. Wow.
The optics here are very Star Trek. People have said this is very Star Trek. Some of the phrasing here is just a little bit unusual. I mean, we're just talking strictly aesthetics here. For me, not a win. Okay, not a great look.
So let's be real here. It's extremely difficult to be a traditional Roman Catholic these days. I mean, I feel for these people. They try to do everything properly. They try to do everything by the book. And no matter what they do, they just can't quite seem to catch a break. So like always, let me be extremely clear from the beginning here. I don't hate Roman Catholics. I don't think they're my enemies. I don't think they're dummies. In fact, I think a lot of them are very smart people. I love these people and I admire their devotion to their tradition and to God. I just think they're wrong about this one thing. Okay, let's flash back to 2 years ago. Here I am studying Roman Catholicism. Where do I go to learn about the papacy? I go to the Roman Catholic Catechism. And what I'm interested in here are the Pope's claims to authority, because Orthodox Christians are not opposed to one of the bishops having a primacy of honor. The objection is a matter of jurisdiction. So the question between Orthodox Christians and Roman Catholics is not whether there was a papacy. The question is, what are the limitations, if any, on his powers? Okay, we'll get into that later, but here's what the Roman Catholic Catechism says. The Roman Pontiff, by reason of his office as Vicar of Christ and as pastor of the entire Church, has full, supreme, and universal power over the whole Church, a power which he can always exercise unhindered. And when the Catechism uses the term unhindered to describe the power of the Pope, they mean unhindered. Pay attention very closely to how this next section of the Catechism is worded here. The College of Bishops has no authority, unless united with the Roman Pontiff, Peter's successor, as its head. As such, this college has supreme and full authority over the universal church, but this power cannot be exercised without the agreement of the Roman Pontiff. So according to the Roman Catholic Catechism, this says that even the College of Bishops cannot do anything unless they have the agreement of the Pope. Now, as you can guess, as a lawyer, I'm a sucker for primary sources. So I purchased Denzinger's Compendium of Creeds, which is just like authorized copies of source documents. I pulled up the document Pastor Eternus from Vatican I, which is a binding document on Roman Catholics, and here's what it says about the power of the Roman Pontiff. And because, by the divine right of apostolic primacy, the Roman Pontiff is at the head of the whole church, we also teach and declare that he is the supreme judge of the faithful, and that one can have recourse to his judgment in all cases pertaining to ecclesiastical jurisdiction. We declare that the judgment of the Apostolic See, which by that they mean Rome, whose authority is unsurpassed, is not subject to review by anyone, nor is anyone allowed to pass judgment on its decision. Therefore, those who say that it is permitted to appeal to an ecumenical council from the decisions of the Roman Pontiff as to an authority superior to the Roman Pontiff stray from the straight path of truth. Now, this section of Pastor Eternus is summed up nicely in the Roman Catholic canon law. Canon 1404 says the first see is judged by no one. In the first C, of course, they're talking about Rome. So let's sum up the Roman Catholic authority claims regarding the Pope. The Pope has full, supreme, universal, and unhindered power over the whole church. The College of Bishops have no authority unless they are united with the Pope. And the decisions of a Pope are not appealable, not even to an ecumenical council. The decisions of the Pope are not subject to review by anyone, nor is anyone permitted to pass judgment on the Pope's decisions. And mind you, this appears in Pastor Aeternus prior to the discussion on infallible statements by the Pope, ex cathedra statements. Pastor Aeternus makes very clear that the Pope's jurisdiction is immediate and not only in matters of faith and morals, but in disciplinary and ecclesiastical matters throughout the whole world. So looking at these documents, the Roman Catholic Catechism, the canons, Vatican I, these are the kinds of documents where Roman Catholics, this is not a matter of opinion, you have to agree with these documents. So when you look at the Catechism, at the canons, at Pastor Aeternus, what kind of power does the Pope have? Memes aside, that is what these documents say on their face. So this is the Roman Catholic hierarchy of authority. You have the Pope, who has full, supreme, universal, and unhindered power over the whole church, over bishops, over the College of Bishops, over cardinals, over priests, over deacons, over everything. You cannot appeal to anybody or any body of people from the Pope's decisions. His decisions are subject to review by no one. Now, I used the term there, hierarchies of authority. This is a very important term, so I'm going to take a moment, bear with me, to explain what I mean by hierarchies of authority. A modern example of a hierarchy of authority is the federal court system in the United States. The federal court system is structured as a hierarchy. As you go up the hierarchy, you have increasing tiers of jurisdiction and authority. Now remember, jurisdiction means that there are just boundaries and limitations to each court's power. Most of the time, there's like a geographical component to that as well. So at the very bottom of the US court's hierarchy of authority, you have what's called a district court. This is a trial court where you initially file your case. District courts have the smallest geographic jurisdiction. For example, in Michigan, we have 2 federal district courts. Let's say you're not happy with the outcome of your case at the district court level and you appeal up the hierarchy of authority to a federal court of appeals. Each federal court of appeals is assigned to review cases from a bundle of district courts. For example, the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals reviews the cases from Michigan, Ohio, Tennessee, and Kentucky. All of the district courts in those states are bound by the decisions of the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. A district court in California might find a decision from the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals persuasive, but they're not bound by that decision. If you don't like the outcome of your case at the Court of Appeals, you can appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States is the highest tier in the hierarchy of authority. There are no appeals from the Supreme Court. Moreover, the decisions of the Supreme Court are binding on all of the district courts and all of the courts of appeals. So there we have a modern example of a hierarchy of authority. And the reason I bring it up is because it's not perfect, but it's pretty analogous to the hierarchy of authority within Holy Orthodoxy. We have bishops at the entry level, local synods, regional synods, pan-Orthodox synods, and then those synods that have obtained ecumenical status. So here's what I ended up doing was I took the Orthodox hierarchy of authority and I took the Roman Catholic hierarchy of authority and I compared them to what we see in the first few centuries of the church. Do we see the Roman Catholic hierarchy of authority, which is nobody can properly do anything unless you have the agreement or are in communion with the Pope? Or do we see the hierarchy of authority that is reflected within Holy Orthodoxy, namely synodality? Well, let's do the work. Let's go through it and look at a few examples. In Acts 15, we see the church get together in council to discuss one of the first controversies in Christianity, the Judaizer heresy. The point at issue in that council was whether provisions of the Torah apply to the Gentile Christians and whether the Gentile Christians need to follow the law of Moses. So what they did was they put a boy on a horse, they sent him to St. Peter so that he could issue a statement on it, and that was the end of the issue. Haha, okay. The elders and the brethren gathered at Jerusalem, they had a council, they discussed it, and they had debates on the issue. Now the apostles and elders came together to consider this matter, and when there had been much dispute, Peter rose up and said to them, "Men and brethren, you know that a good while ago God chose among us that by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe. So God, who knows the heart, acknowledged them by giving them the Holy Spirit just as he did to us, and made no distinction between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. Now therefore, why do you test God by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? But we believe that through the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, we shall be saved in the same manner as they." Then all the multitude kept silent and listened to Barnabas and Paul declaring how many miracles and wonders God had worked through them among the Gentiles. So what do we see in Acts 15 so far? We see a lot of debate between the apostles and the elders. The text says that there were disputes, and then Peter gets everybody to hush, Peter gives his own statement. Paul and Barnabas give their own statements after that as well. And after they had become silent, James answered, saying, "Men and brethren, listen to me. Simon has declared how God at the first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. In with this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written." St. James tells everybody in the council to hush. He says, Peter is right. Look, what Peter says actually matches up with what the Old Testament says. From verse 19, we're told that James says, "Therefore, I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood." So what does James say at the end of this? James says, I judge that we should not bother the Gentiles. So who is the we? Well, St. Peter is included in the we. So James passes a judgment that is binding on Peter. So let's sum up the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council. Who is there? The elders and the apostles. There's dispute among all of them. Simon Peter gets everyone to hush. He gives his statement. Paul gives his statement. Barnabas gives his statement. St. James issues a judgment, a decree, based on everything that he's heard. He mentions Simon Peter in particular, and he says that Simon Peter is right. Why? Because of his infallible teaching office? No, because what Simon Peter said matches with what the prophets say. Then James issues a judgment that's binding on all of the apostles and elders there at that council, including St. Peter. This very clearly matches up more with an Orthodox hierarchy of authority than the Roman Catholic hierarchy of authority. The next early church controversy we can look at is the quartodeciman controversy. The quartodeciman controversy is one I speak about frequently on my channel because it's so early. It starts around the 150s AD and comes to its peak around the 190s AD. You guys probably all know the story by now, but basically there's a dispute over when the church should be celebrating Easter. There's a bundle of churches in the East, in Turkey, that celebrate Easter on the Jewish calendar, so it falls on a different day every year. The rest of the church celebrates Easter on Sunday, regardless of what day of the week it falls on. The climax of this dispute was around the 190s AD when Pope Victor, the Bishop of Rome, sought to excommunicate all of those Eastern bishops who celebrated Easter on the Jewish timeline. So because Pope Victor had full, supreme, universal, and unhindered authority, he excommunicated them. That was the end of the story. No, that's wrong. The quartodeciman controversy is recorded in Eusebius. Here's what he tells us. Victor, who presided at Rome, immediately tried to cut off from the common unity as heterodox all the Asian dioceses, along with neighboring churches, and pilloried them in letters announcing the absolute excommunication of all the brethren there. Notice he says tried to cut off. But not all the bishops were pleased by this, and they requested instead that he pursue the cause of peace, unity, and love toward his neighbors. Their words, sharply reprimanding Victor, are still extant. Among them was Irenaeus, who wrote in the name of the Christians he supervised in Gaul. So what does Eusebius tell us? Pope Victor tried to excommunicate a bunch of bishops over in Turkey, but he was reprimanded by a coalition of bishops. Is that the Orthodox hierarchy of authority or the Roman Catholic one? It's the Orthodox hierarchy of authority. The next controversy was resolved at the 7th Council of Carthage in the year 256 AD under Saint Cyprian. The point at issue there was whether people who were baptized by heretics need to be rebaptized when entering the Orthodox Catholic Church. Now there are some more nuances to this, but generally the position of Pope Stephen, the Bishop of Rome at the time, was that those who are baptized by heretics, when they are received into the church, they do not need to be rebaptized depending on the form of the baptism. They just need to be chrismated, and that makes the prior baptism effective. St. Cyprian of Carthage had the exact opposite view of Pope Stephen. He said that everybody coming into the church needs to be baptized. It doesn't matter if you had a baptism that was proper in form by some heretic prior to joining the church. Now, Pope Stephen, hearing that St. Cyprian had deviated from his ruling or his position, sent letters of condemnation to St. Cyprian over his position on this. So St. Cyprian, recognizing the full, supreme, universal, and unhindered authority of Pope Stephen, sent a letter back apologizing. No, St. Cyprian called a council in Carthage. He got 87 bishops, and this is what was said at the opening of that council. It remains that upon this same matter, each of us should bring forward what we think, judging no man, nor rejecting anyone from the rite of communion, if he should think differently from us. For neither does any of us set himself up as a bishop of bishops, nor by tyrannical terror does any compel his colleague to the necessity of obedience, since every bishop, according to the allowance of his liberty and power, has his own proper right of judgment, and can no more be judged by another than he himself can judge another. So we see at this council in 256 AD in Carthage, the Bishop of Rome making a judgment call on this issue of baptism, and St. Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, says, "You're wrong. not only are you wrong, you cannot tell me what to do here. He says, I have the liberty and power to make my own judgment. Every bishop does. And look at what St. Augustine, in his dispute with the Donatists, later says about St. Cyprian and this episode with Pope Stephen. He, St. Cyprian, I say, abundantly shows that he was most willing to correct his own opinion if anyone should prove to him that it is certain that the baptism of Christ can be given by those who have strayed from the fold, as that it could not be lost when they strayed, on which subject we have already said much. Nor should we ourselves venture to assert anything of the kind were we not supported by the unanimous authority of the whole Church, to which he himself would unquestionably have yielded if that time the truth of his question had been placed beyond dispute by the investigation and decree of a plenary council. A plenary council refers to an ecumenical council of the whole Church. So what is St. Augustine saying about St. Cyprian here? He's saying it was fine for St. Cyprian to disagree with the Bishop of Rome, but had this gone to an ecumenical council, St. Cyprian would have rightly obeyed that. So which hierarchy of authority is St. Augustine describing here? This is the Orthodox hierarchy of authority, not the Roman Catholic one. So let's briefly review these three historical examples we went over. Acts 15 shows James issuing a judgment that's binding on Peter. The quartodeciman controversy shows Pope Victor being reprimanded by a coalition of bishops. And in the Council of Carthage in 256 AD, according to St. Augustine, St. Cyprian was fine to disagree with the Bishop of Rome. He would not be okay to disagree with the decree of an ecumenical council. All three show that the early Church used the Orthodox hierarchy of authority and did not use the Roman Catholic hierarchy of authority. That came later. It was made up later. And you know, there are many Roman Catholics, high-ranking Roman Catholics, that agree with the Orthodox position that the Orthodox hierarchy of authority was the one you see in the early Church. In fact, the Vatican put together a commission to investigate this very issue. On the Roman Catholic side of the commission, you had 2 cardinals, you had many archbishops, bishops, Roman Catholic scholars, and there were Orthodox metropolitans and bishops that were present there as well. Here's one of the conclusions of that commission in the 2016 Chieti Document. Over the centuries, a number of appeals were made to the Bishop of Rome, also from the East, in disciplinary matters, such as the deposition of a bishop. Appeals regarding disciplinary matters were also made to the See of Constantinople and to other sees. Such appeals to major sees were always treated in a synodical way. Appeals to the Bishop of Rome from the East expressed the communion of the Church, but the Bishop of Rome did not exercise canonical authority over the churches of the East. So you have 2 Roman Catholic cardinals, many Roman Catholic bishops and archbishops, many Roman Catholic scholars conceding that in the first millennia, the Church was synodal. It had an Orthodox hierarchy of authority, not a Roman Catholic hierarchy of authority. Even high-ranking, influential Roman Catholic figures are not disputing this anymore. Those are some pretty nice arguments and historical facts you have there, Alex. Too bad Peter's the rock and he has the keys. That's an excellent point. I'm glad that came up. Let's go to Matthew 16 and let's read that passage. Jesus said to them, the disciples, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." So the first question here is, when Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church," what is he talking about? What rock? Roman Catholics would say Peter. Peter, the person Peter, is the rock. But you know, there are some Western Church Fathers that disagree with that interpretation. St. Hilary of Poitiers, when talking about Matthew 16, says this: "It is upon the rock of this confession that the building of the church rests. The faith is the foundation of the church, and therefore the gates of hell are powerless against her. This faith possesses the keys of the kingdom of heaven. What this faith bound and loosed on earth will also be bound and loosed in heaven. This faith is the gift of which the Father has revealed, not to misrepresent Christ as a creature made from nothing, but to confess him as the Son of God in accordance with a nature that is truly his own." This is not St. Gregory Palamas or St. Photius. This is St. Hilary of Poitiers. This is a Western Church Father. He says Peter's confession is the rock, not Peter. He even says the keys go with this proper confession of faith, not with the person of St. Peter. So when Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church," it's not perfectly clear among the fathers that the rock is referring to St. Peter and not his confession of faith. But let's throw the Roman Catholics a bone here. Let's say this verse does say that it's upon the person of St. Peter on which the church is built. Well, St. Paul tells us in Ephesians chapter 2 that the household of God is built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. So yeah, it might be the case that St. Peter was the first rock on which the church was built. But St. Paul teaches us that all the apostles and prophets are foundation stones of the church, and Christ himself is the cornerstone. St. John the theologian confirms that each apostle is a foundation stone of the church in Revelation chapter 21. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls filled with the 7 last plagues came to me and talked with me, saying, "Come, I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife." Who is the bride of Christ? The church. He carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain and showed me the great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. Now the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So St. Paul tells us that the foundation of the church is all the apostles and prophets, with the cornerstone being Christ. St. John the theologian tells us that the church, the bride of Christ, has 12 foundations, the 12 disciples of the Lamb. So there's no way you can say that it's only St. Peter on which the church is built. It's built on all of the apostles. So even if we grant the interpretation that the person of Peter is the rock on which the church is built, St. Paul and St. John agree. It's all the apostles, it's all the disciples that make up the foundation of the church. It's not just one apostle. In fact, St. Paul explicitly warns us in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 to not do that. It has been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household, that there are contentions among you. Now I say this, that each of you says, I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos, or I am of Cephas, or I am of Christ. And Cephas refers to Peter there. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul? The more I learn about this debate between Roman Catholicism and Holy Orthodoxy and Protestantism, about the nature of the papacy, I just keep on seeing Roman Catholics saying, but we are of Cephas, we are of Peter. St. Paul says to not think or speak that way. Yet that's exactly what we see Roman Catholic apologists doing. I don't know how much more direct you can be. St. Paul literally says, don't do that. So when it comes to the rock in Matthew 16, I agree with St. Hilary that the rock refers to St. Peter's confession. But even if it didn't refer to St. Peter's confession of faith and it referred to Peter the person, that still wouldn't justify any of the papal claims to universal jurisdiction over all Christians everywhere with no limitation on his power whatsoever. Because it's not only St. Peter who built up the church, it's all the prophets, all the apostles, in particular, the 12 foundations of the 12 disciples, as it's said in Revelation. And I just can't get over that St. Paul explicitly warns us about this, yet that's all that the Roman Catholic apologists do. I am of Cephas. I am of Peter. You're not supposed to talk that way. You're not supposed to think that way. It says so in the Bible. Now, we already talked about the power of the keys. St. Hilary associates that with Peter's confession of faith, not with Peter the person. But the power of the keys refers specifically to the binding and loosing power. And if you go 2 chapters later into Matthew 18, you see that Jesus gives the binding and loosing power to each of the disciples, to all of the apostles. Now, the second main passage used to support the Roman Catholic doctrine of the papacy comes from John 21. John 21 says, starting from verse 15, "So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' He said to him, 'Feed my lambs.' He said to him a second time, 'Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' He said to him, 'Tend my sheep.' He said to him a third time, 'Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?' Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, 'Do you love me?' And he said to him, 'Lord, you know all things, you know that I love you.' Jesus said to him, 'Feed my sheep.'" Now, I've seen Roman Catholic apologists and binding Roman Catholic documents like Pastor Eternus refer to this passage in John 21 as granting the power of universal, personal, immediate jurisdiction over all Christians everywhere to Peter. I'm not sure how you get that from "feed my sheep." Nonetheless, here's how St. Hilary explains that passage from John 21. "Peter, the witness for whom the Father was asked that his faith might not fail in temptation, who, after he had repeated the profession of faith that had been requested of him, grieved that he was still being put to the test by a third question, as if he were wavering and uncertain. And therefore, after this threefold purification of the weaknesses of his temptation, also merited to hear the threefold declaration of the Lord, 'Feed my sheep,' who, amid the silence of all the apostles, recognized the Son of God by the revelation of the Father. For this is beyond the limits of human weaknesses, and deserved the supereminent glory by the confession of his blessed faith." So when St. Hilary of Poitiers talks about John 21, he doesn't see this as some universal, personal, immediate, imminent jurisdiction over all Christians everywhere. No, this is a threefold purification for the 3 times that Peter denied Christ. He denied Christ 3 times. He has to affirm that he's going to feed Christ's sheep 3 times. And St. Hilary of Poitiers is not the only Western Church father to think this way. We already saw that St. Augustine referred to an ecumenical council as above the authority of the Bishop of Rome and affirming the Orthodox hierarchy of authority. And St. Hilary and St. Augustine are not alone in that. St. Ambrose also has something to say on the subject. Nor was Paul inferior to Peter, though the latter was the foundation of the church and the former a wise builder, knowing how to make firm the footsteps of the nations who believed. Paul was not, I say, unworthy of the fellowship of the apostles, but is easily comparable with the first, and second to none. Second to Peter? No, second to none. So let's do a brief recap here because we went over a lot. The Acts 15 Jerusalem Council, the quartodeciman controversy, the 7th Council of Carthage in 258 AD. All of those controversies affirm the Orthodox hierarchy of authority, not the Roman Catholic hierarchy of authority. St. Cyprian, St. Hilary, St. Ambrose, and St. Augustine all affirm the Orthodox hierarchy of authority, not the Roman Catholic hierarchy of authority. Roman Catholic cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and scholars all affirm that this is the case in the 2016 Chieti Document. Moreover, very notable Western Church Fathers agree with the Orthodox interpretation of Matthew 16 and John 21. Anyway, am I trying to like dunk on Roman Catholics here or be like triumphalist in my position? No. These are just the things that I saw when I took a step back and I looked at the history and I looked at the concessions from each side. It seems fairly clear that the church of the first 1,000 years, and especially the church of the first few centuries, was not Roman Catholic. It did not have the Roman Catholic hierarchy of authority. It had the Orthodox hierarchy of authority. They were all Orthodox. And looking at it as a lawyer, as a litigator, it is abundantly clear that the Orthodox position is the most defensible position. So much so that it persuaded me that Holy Orthodoxy is the church founded by Jesus Christ. The Orthodox Catholic Church is founded on St. Peter, but not only St. Peter, it's St. Peter and all the prophets and the apostles, and the cornerstone being Christ. Exactly how St. Paul describes in Ephesians chapter 2. The Roman Catholic Catechism teaches that Holy Orthodoxy does have valid sacraments through apostolic succession, and St. Paul teaches us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that the church is unified through the Eucharist. From the Roman Catholic position, a pope seems redundant, and from the Orthodox perspective, it's just ahistorical. So consider this a call, my beloved Trad Caths. You're not my enemy. Come to Holy Orthodoxy. The papal claims of full, supreme, universal, unhindered power over all Christians everywhere. It's made up. They're in accretion. The early church didn't act that way. They didn't act that way in the Acts 15 Council. They didn't act that way in the quartodeciman controversy. They didn't act that way at the 7th Council of Carthage under St. Cyprian. The early church simply did not have that hierarchy of authority, and more Catholics are realizing this as evidenced by the Chieti Document. So something tells me this will not be the last video that I'll be making on this topic. There's a lot more history we could go through. I didn't even get to the first ecumenical council yet. There are dozens and dozens of canons that talk about how bishops cannot cross into another bishop's jurisdiction without permission, and there's no mention of an exception for the Bishop of Rome. Anyway, that does it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was educational for you. To my Orthodox brothers and sisters watching, I hope it equipped you with a few more arguments to defend your faith, and hopefully there are many Trad Caths watching. Come to Holy Orthodoxy. We're waiting for you with open arms. We love you. If you made it this far, don't forget to like the video if you liked the video. Sub to the channel for more. Have a great week, guys. God bless.